Yeah, I definitely think the Ina Garten piece had something to do with it. I touched on this a little bit before, but talking about like what is good olive oil, what is good vanilla, and this isn't groundbreaking. I mean, a lot of people have been asking this question, like, what do you mean, Ina? But there are so many ways that you can answer that question, and I think one of the things that I really love about food as kind of a vessel for communication or for meaning is, I mean, there are so many different things you can talk about. First of all, with food, it hits all of the senses. You can see it, hear it, touch it, taste it, smell it. And we'll just do a little thought experiment really quickly. Like if you take a tomato, right? I mean, there are so many different things that you can talk about with a tomato. You can talk about industrial agriculture and the way that tomatoes have slowly lost their flavor over time. You can talk about labor exploitation with tomatoes, bringing this back to Florida. If anybody has not read Tomatoland by Barry Estabrook, I really recommend it. You can talk about imperialism and colonialism. Like if we take, for example, Italy and India, two cuisines where tomato has become, I would say, integral and in some ways representative of cuisine, where tomatoes are not native to either of those places. Tomatoes have not always been a part of that cuisine. And a lot of the time they still aren't a part of that cuisine, but in a lot of ways
Yeah.
tomatoes have become very representative of Italian and some Indian dishes. So, there you can talk about things like, the spice trade, you can talk about globalization, you can talk about intercultural exchange. They're just I could go on and on and on about this forever, but you can talk about class, you can talk about gender, you can talk about race, you can talk about globalization. I kind of already mentioned that. You can talk about art, literature, music. I mean, you've composed music about food, so
Right. Yeah.
I know you kind of pick up what I'm putting down.
Yeah.
There's so many ways that you can interpret it, and there are so many ways that you can make meaning out of food. And this kind of comes back to what I was saying about cultural awareness. Like everybody is going to encounter a food object or a food item in a different way. It might trigger a memory for them. It might remind them of a particular place. It might transport them back in time. It's such a fruitful, pun intended, conversation starter and vehicle for storytelling that I'm obsessed with it. I love food writing. I will always, in some form or fashion, I think, try to find a food angle in most, if not everything, that I write.
So my food journey, shockingly, maybe started when I moved to Florida. Actually,
Oh, I didn't know that.
I was I've talked about this just a little bit on the podcast, but I'll talk about it a lot bit now with you because I was the absolute pickiest eater for, I mean, I'm 33, so like most of my life still,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Like it wasn't until I moved to Florida and Susanna, my wife, my now wife, who was my girlfriend then, had a lot to do with it because like I remember she made me like green beans one night. She was like,
Mhm.
I'm gonna make like chicken and green beans or something. And I was like, "Ugh, I don't like green beans. Like I can't eat green beans. And she's like, you're gonna eat them. I'm making them. You're gonna eat them, right? And this gets into like something like her mom. Susanna has been steeped in like food culture a lot of her life. Her mom owned Chinese restaurants, and a lot of like the love language from her mom, for example, is like food, right? Like, and so at any rate, Susanna was like, "You're gonna show that you love me by eating what I make you, right?" And so she made
Go
these green
Susanna.
yeah,
I love
yeah,
that.
it changed my life. She made like these green beans, and it was like fresh green beans, like from the produce section, and like I'd never actually seen that before. I like my family always had canned green beans. She like had like garlic and red onion sort of thing going on, and like a vinaigrette. And I took a bite reluctantly, and then I was like, what do you mean green beans can taste like this, right? So
Yeah.
I think like that kind of like opened the door for me. And then I think what kicked it down, and this is something I wanted to talk with you about, was Anthony Bourdain's work, like, kicked down the door for me, and, like, being able to see him go on TV, like, go to all these different places, and, Tampa still, but I think especially 10 years ago or even 8 years ago, like, had such an amazing food scene that it's just like the stars aligned for me, and like I watched all of Anthony Bourdain's stuff like one summer, and Susanna was force feeding me stuff that I began to love, and then like I'd go to all these different restaurants. So I say all that. It sounds like I'm randomly rambling, but I say all that because I used to be someone who did not think about food at all. Like it was, and
Mhm.
I think a lot of people in our society, in our culture, don't think about food. It's just like they either totally forget to eat or they only eat because they have to live. Do you ever think about like how you can change the way people perceive food in your writing, or is that maybe like too big of a an issue?
No, I don't think so. I think, Anthony Bourdain, certainly somebody that I read and read and read and watched and read, um, miss him so
Oh
much.
yeah,
He kind of had this like uncanny ability to like be the voice of reason, but like be cool as shit about it. Like, sorry to cuss, but I mean, he, I don't know. I mean, but for me, Anthony Bourdain was kind of the first person that I saw model this idea of, historical context, cultural awareness, and empathetic rigor. I mean, in his show and in his writing, and, he's taking you to these other places, and he's just, I mean, there's no judgment. There's no turning his nose up at something. There's no disrespect. I mean, he's just treating everybody that he encounters as a fellow human being on the planet that we all
right,
inhabit and are all partially responsible for. And so he was definitely a role model to me, I think, for that approach. And was really important for me in getting me to think about food in different ways because I think I really first started really reading him and paying. I mean, he's been around for a long time, but he'd oh god, I hate even having to do that. He'd been around for a really long time, and I started interacting with his work when I was getting serious about food writing. And at the time I was doing it because I was like, well, going to restaurant openings is really fun, and doing the kind of prefix menus is really cool, and getting to go to these fancy parties and write about them and try food and get exposed to all of these cool things. This is so amazing. While all these people that I know from college are chained to their desks, putting in 50, 60 hours a week. And I'm out here having fun and getting
right,
paid for it. Eventually, that started changing. Eventually, I kind of wanted to write more serious things. There is a huge food insecurity problem in the Tampa Bay area. When I reported on it, I think 1 in 4 school children were considered food insecure, didn't know where their food was coming from. But back to my point, I was interested in things like urban farming and food insecurity, and I was really thinking about, this idea of, back then we called it food deserts. Now I think the more appropriate term is food apartheid. But why were parts of St. Pete loaded with grocery stores? Like, you could walk out of one grocery store, trip, fall, and when you stood back up, you were in another grocery store. And then you go to some parts of it and there are no grocery stores. And I remember that was kind of the thing that really started getting me thinking about food in a different way, because now you're starting to think about race. St. Pete is still pretty racially segregated in terms of geography and where people live, and school zones and all kinds of things. You can talk about class, you can talk about socioeconomic status. There are all kinds of things that you can talk about, and I didn't feel like I really had the vocabulary to do that. I didn't feel like I had the appropriate background to do that empathetically and ethically and properly. So I wanted to report on those more serious food issues. And so I went to grad school in Mississippi and did my master's in Southern studies there. But yeah, kind of bobbing and weaving and coming back to your original question about, Anthony Bourdain and this kind of, changing the way that people think about food. There's this idea that food is something that we can all universally relate to on some level. Not everybody has access to the same foods. So I want to be clear about that. But, as human beings, food is something that we have to eat to survive. And so at a basic level, we all understand that. And we can all relate to food in that way. And so I think that it's really important that if there is this one universal thing that we can all relate to, then there is this one universal thing that we can use to talk about the human experience and to talk about living, and
Right.
coexisting and all of those things. And I am of the personal opinion that one can't exist freely until everyone exists freely. And I think food is a really good way of getting people to think about that, because it is something that's like, oh, I haven't thought about it that way before, and it's generally, I mean, food is generally like a low stakes entry point, you know what I mean? Like a tomato or a slice of key lime pie, you know what I mean? Like you can start with something like that to get somebody's attention, and then you can really kind of push people to think about things in a different way. And I think that's really appealing. And I don't want to say that I am always effective at it. There's some people who are really good at it, Anthony Bourdain. And then, it's something, to constantly work at and practice. And there's also this part of it that I haven't really talked about, but also being able to find, the publications that are willing to put out, those kinds of narratives, or
Right.
to talk about food in that way. Like you have to be really conscientious isn't the word that I'm looking for, but you do have to be intentional about, where you're publishing certain things. And yeah.
Well, I guess as with anything that one might choose to write about or talk about or anything in the world, I mean, there's like a spectrum of things like you're talking about. And I mean, I don't know anything about publications, but I know like when I open up Instagram, for example, and I'm scrolling and I'm fed all this content that I didn't even sign up for, and a lot of it's food because that's an interest of mine, and it's all like
Hmm.
feel good recipe, like sharp looking, like influencer fun stuff, right? Because
Right.
that's what sells, and
Yeah.
I'm guessing that the majority of publications, that's the kind of flavor they're looking for. No pun intended there.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are a handful of magazines out there and a handful of publications, I should say, out there that do want to tell impactful stories through food. I can think of a handful of digital born publications. I can think of a few print. Oxford American does a lot of
Mm,
really cool food culture stuff.
I love that one.
Um, Sever is also really good about, cultural awareness and empathy and, not being Americentric, which I think is also really important. So, I mean, there are publications out there that do it. You just, you have to tailor your pitch to who you're sending it out to, and make sure that, I don't know, I guess for me, it was just, I just had to be clear with myself that I'm not interested in writing about recipes.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Micromaker by Loose Leaf Transmissions. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the inner workings of the creative life. If this resonated with you, be sure to check out the full conversation on Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast exploring craft and process, philosophy and inspiration, and the honest, often messy parts of being an artist, creative uncertainty, purpose and identity, and resilience. You can find Music Maker wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting musicmakerpodcast.com.